China looks like they are going to reach 43 to 45% of total global manufacturing capacity by 2030. And that's bonkers. Like that's a value that hasn't been hit. You know, the UK in the Industrial Revolution and the United States post-World War II are the only two times that there has ever been one country that was so dominant in manufacturing. And they have done this in a very, very thoughtful, long-term, programmatic way.
This is All Quiet on the Second Front, podcast where boring conversations around defense tech and national security come to die. Join me, Tyler Sweat, and my Second Front homies as we dismantle the mundane and cut through the bureaucratic bullshit to demystify the world of defense tech. But be warned, this is not a typical government podcast. Are you ready to get weird? What's up, everybody? I'm your host, Tyler Sweat. Welcome to another episode of All Quiet on the Second Front, the podcast where boring defense talk comes to die. Very excited today. Bret Boyd in town from Sustainment. So Bret, thanks for making some time to come by, brother.
Yeah, it's good to be with you, Tyler. Thank you.
Heck yeah. So we share a little bit of similarities in the background, but for folks listening who might not know sort of your story, kind of give them the Bret just once over the world on kind of who you are.
Yeah, now look, in broad strokes, I mean, the area of overlap here is we both did undergrad at West Point. So I was actually a senior at West Point when the towers went down.
Yep, was a freshman there. Yep.
Yeah, which, as we were just discussing, was kind of a high adventure time. And so, yeah, branched infantry, deployed to Iraq 4 times, spent most of the time with the 75th Ranger Regiment, running around doing those things. I actually got out in 2007 and got into tech shortly thereafter. So I've kind of been in this building company phase here for the last, well, I'm getting old, 15 plus years here.
And, you talk about sort of being in that sort of building phase, having 10, 15 years sort of like, what are you working on now? And what's sort of got you excited?
Yeah, so the business that we're working on now is called Sustainment. So we started this a little bit over 5 years ago. And essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to fix manufacturing in the United States. So as you look at manufacturing, it is a huge industry, strategically important, employs 13 million people, contributes 2.3 trillion to GDP. So manufacturing is important, but it is a very fragmented industry. Yeah. 250,000 companies, the vast majority of whom are small businesses. So the combat power for American manufacturing is in the small business segment. So the fundamental observation that we had here, that my co-founder and I had as we went into this business, is that it is too hard to find and get work done with U.S. manufacturers. And this was the era where the Alibabas and so on were coming up that made it really easy to find manufacturers on the other side of the world. And we simply said there needs to be a platform that makes it easy to work with U.S. manufacturers. So we set out on that. We have a commercial business where we build software for commercial manufacturers, essentially building connective tissue in between all these companies.
Yeah.
Right? So we do everything from help me find a local supplier, let me input the website of one of my Chinese manufacturers, maybe you can recommend some local suppliers in my area, all the way through the quoting process, all the way through the awarding projects and managing process. So we basically take all of those workflows in between companies and help digitize those. Yeah. And what that does is it gives us this amazing data set of who all the manufacturers are, where they are, what equipment they have, what certifications they have, what they bid on, what they perform on. And so we've got, what we believe to be the largest network of engaged U.S. manufacturing suppliers in the country. And these are both suppliers that are part of the DoD supply chain, but primarily those that are not. We call these the non-traditionals.
Yeah.
So we also have a defense business where we essentially leverage this asset to help DoD supply chain teams be faster and more efficient and essentially expand the defense industrial base. So, imagine software products that we sell into, think the depots and some of these these massive supply chain organizations. I mean, many of these men and women are working with some pretty old school tools. There's a lot of email. There's a lot of hey, I fill out my part of the PDF and I email it to you.
Yep.
And so we build software to make all that 5 or 10 times more efficient. But really interestingly, use AI to say, hey, when you're looking at this item number, we can see what that part is, and we can actually identify here are some manufacturers that you might not know, but that you should know. So we've got a software product that we sell into depots that does that, and then we've also got a big R&D initiative where we've built a ton of AI to kind of autonomously look at technical data and make inferences on who should build these things. Cool. Again, with the whole goal of being to like make it easier to expand the defense industrial base and kind of go faster in the back end of the supply chain.
Yeah. I mean, certainly not to hit the nail right on the head here, but certainly an interesting time to be in this space. You're kind of at the crossroads of a lot of different, call it tailwinds, call it your sort of strategic initiatives with whether it's reindustrialization and sort of reshoring manufacturing, whether it's incenting sort of, you said non-traditionals, bringing the non-traditionals, maybe diversifying supply chains, building some of that resiliency. And, you can't ignore sort of the Doge in the room, right? The efficiency side of it. What's that been like, sort of being at the epicenter of a lot of those pretty strong trends right now, brother?
No, look, it's a great question. And I do like to say this, that we sit right at the intersection of government efficiency and productivity, plus onshoring U.S. manufacturing, plus building up the U.S. industrial base to counter China in a future scenario. And I think all of those are incredible tailwinds, but it's also happening at the same time that the DoD is going through this huge gyration of kind of reorienting and retooling in many areas. But look, like this is the moment for our business, and I'm really glad that we are 5 years into the journey, not trying to start this right now, because this effort to like bring together tens of thousands of manufacturing suppliers and get them active and get them engaged, like that's a hard industry out there. Like this has been a slog.
Yeah. I mean, it's also, how have you seen receptiveness? And you think about, I think when the average person thinks about a depot, to your point, right? There's a clipboard, there's a checklist. I think a PDF is probably pretty advanced in a lot of places. So you've got a relatively sort of like industrial age, kind of traditional vertical factory, and you're bringing this really interesting sort of like horizontal data integration, very knowledge age kind of play to it. How are you seeing sort of that receptiveness? Are you seeing adoption? Because there's a little culture change in there, some change management maybe.
Yeah, now this is the hardest part of all of it, because at the end of this really is around leadership and change management and organizational transformation. And when you build, as you know, when you build a startup, like our timeline, when I look at the clock, I think of the clock very differently than, a great professional working in the depot or whatever does. And so, I mean, at the end of the day, like this whole idea of like, how do I engage with the nation as my supply chain? How do I use America as my factory? It is really, really something that is important. And it's actually at the core of a lot of the problems that tie to readiness of equipment. So if you look at the chain, if you look at something like a depot, and these are, imagine, biggest building you've ever seen, tons of aircraft stacked up, getting worked on, thousands of people, you got people walking laps around for exercise, for lunch, the building is so big. And these organizations have both internal manufacturing capacity, but they are buying a ton of repair parts from commercial manufacturers, from their suppliers. And that whole process of like, I have a requirement for a replacement part to put in, the B-52 or whatever, like that process of like, who can build this part for me? How can I get that company on contract? If it's a new supplier, how can I actually take them through the approval process to have them become an approved supplier, to then how do I actually manage delivery of the part, et cetera, et cetera? Like that's actually the critical path to aircraft readiness ratings, right? So if these processes of like, I can't find any suppliers, or I don't really know how to try, so I'm just going to go to the same sole source supplier that we've used previously there. Yeah. That's one way that you get really, really exposed on, price and timing via lack of optionality. And when we look at our commercial business, I mean, essentially what we sell, like we call our product a supplier relationship management product. Almost in the same way like a sales team will use a CRM to have like one comprehensive data picture of their customers. We do that for procurement and supply chain teams so that they can look down and say, all of my suppliers in one place, pushing data to me, easy to pull these in. I want to onboard new suppliers. I'm weak here. Easy to get quotes, easy to award projects, connected to your ERP, easy to do supplier scoring and analytics and so on. So this is our commercial product. But at the end of the day, for businesses, this is actually about agility and speed, right? So what those companies need and what we provide on the commercial side of the business is software that allows you to say, okay, look, world's changing quickly. I need, what I need to build my part so I can sell to my customers here, and I really need options, right? I need options from different suppliers so that I can have right place, right time, right quality. And in some cases, like if your traditional supplier is overloaded, you need the ability to like go to option 2 and option 3. And like that's how you get really, really dynamic in the commercial world. And I think there are a ton of lessons to be learned in the DoD world when you've got all of this like obsolescence and kind of single sources of supply and these huge barriers of entry for companies to new entrants into the supply chain. You've got all of this kind of institutional inertia around it takes too much time and it costs too much to verify a secondary source of supply. So like we're really trying to sort through all of this, but it's a journey.
So you led into sort of the question I was going to ask next, which you talk about the opportunities sort of in that commercial side to bring in some of the diversification, maybe help give better negotiating leverage, diffuse some sort of, maybe price or vendor lock in there. You talk on the government side, we recognizing all those problems still exist. You just alluded to some of them, but you also alluded to some of the barriers, the challenges to sort of even come in as, a non-traditional or a new entrant. What's that been like so far, especially, working a manufacturing-focused solution, but a software product?
Yeah, so look, it's important to tie back to the problem here first. So we have had, since, 93 or whenever the Last Supper was here in the 90s here, we have had a massive contraction of the number of companies that support the DoD across all categories.
Yep.
So this is ranging from manufacturing, et cetera. So you've essentially got this industry that has become very, very specialized and very siloed in their cost structures and how they approach the market and who's excellent and who's kind of inside the firewall or inside the fence post through these bureaucratic processes. Like this is kind of the state of the world. The DLA pushed something out of having lost 40% of their small business suppliers since 2016. I think something like that is
astounding
indicative.
Figure.
Oh, it's bonkers.
Yeah.
You even look like in the 90s, I want to say it was over 70% of like contracting dollars went to companies that were both commercial and defense. And now I think it's like less than 5%. I read a CSIS report on this a few months ago, and it's fascinating. But like if we are going to reindustrialize the country, and I'm deeply excited to see this be like a uniquely bipartisan policy initiative that we're really getting after right now. But if we are going to reindustrialize the country and we're going to expand the defense industrial base, necessarily what it looks like, is we are going to have to figure out how to broaden that. And the excellence in manufacturing in this country actually sits in this other 95% of manufacturing businesses that are crushing it, building oil, drilling equipment, building things for semiconductors and so on. Yep. And these businesses fundamentally, like this was our hypothesis in starting this, but we have validated this over the past few years. Those businesses that are doing great work, especially in these other like high tolerance industries like oil and gas and like semiconductor manufacturing, have the same equipment. They have the same quality procedures, maybe a different variant of like an ISO cert or something like that, but they have the experience, the equipment, the quality standards to be able to support defense manufacturing. Like it's there, the capacity is there. I think this fundamental problem is like, how do we access it? Which then ties to the barriers of entry, question and so on. And again, some of that is technology and automation. Some of that is regulatory reform to kind of revisit some of these policies that were built like before the internet and see if they still make sense.
Yep.
And some of these is actually delegating and empowering smart engineers on the defense side and smart engineers on the commercial side to like work together and decide if they're a fit, which is how this works in commercial industry.
Yeah. What you talk about sort of getting it to fit, bringing sort of these maybe arcane or outdated sort of regulations to bear. What's it been like sort of delivering for sustainment? Where have you seen success, maybe barriers, opportunities for improvement? I'll put a positive spin on it.
Yeah, no, look, and I'll actually use this to talk about the relationship between our companies here. But again, so we sell software into the supply chain organizations. And a lot of these supply chain organizations have not been at the forefront of advanced tech, right? And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. But a lot of these organizations are just kind of adventure learning on like, how do we buy software? What does it look like to buy these different types of things. And so we actually went through the SBIR process, like a phase 1, phase 2, and ultimately got a phase 3, which our customer told us was the first logistics phase 3 to be awarded across the Air Force, which was great.
That rocks.
But then we had to go through this whole ATO process, and our partners on the government side were doing that for the first time, and they're trying to figure it out. And these are professionals that grew up, working acquisition in a whole different world, and now they're trying to figure out cloud certification and software and so on. And so, as like our journey with your organization is that we went through this process with the Air Force and spent about 9 months and really didn't make a ton of progress towards migrating our product onto their cloud. And we're very grateful for the collaboration with your organization and, candidly, the collaboration with our Air Force partners who said, yeah, if you've got a better way that you can do this faster, we're open to that. And, we like to tell the story that with Second Front, we got done, I want to say, in 53 or 54 days, the full kind of soup to nuts ATO approval, which again, we had been kind of pounding our head on for a while. And so these kind of things, like, we're proud of that. But these are some of the challenges when you kind of get down to it. And it's easy to say, the DOD needs to move faster and so on. But when you look at the men and women on the DOD side, like, they're trying.
It's
they're not
hard.
super
Yeah,
well
to your
equipped.
point, it's also hard to yell at somebody to go faster when you look at, like, the playbook they've been given, and it's like 10,000 words of a bunch of jargon. And then there are 3 local policy memos that are orthogonal to the existing playbook, and they're like, what am I supposed to freaking do here? And I think that's been one of our big learnings. It's just like how much there is the regulation, there is the policy, and then there are localized sort of variants that just flow down, and that just compounds over and over, and you get down to the KO or the ISM or the AO, and they're like, I don't even understand what the hell I'm supposed to be doing here. And they know they can get in trouble for it because government sure got somebody screaming next to them saying, if you do this wrong, you're going to go to jail, or you own the risk, or blah, blah, blah.
I actually think that's the key point. And that's the point, like, with our experience, I do think that it's a lot, I don't know, the downside for a professional on the government side, the downside for them of accidentally missing rule number 9,872 that they hadn't looked at generally seems to outweigh the upside 100%. Of, like, I own the mission and the outcome, and I actually have, like, not just accountability for the outcome, but it's my success if we go do that. I feel like the distribution of those is so difficult, and so we've kind of worked through that on the software side, but this is actually the core of onboarding new manufacturing suppliers as well. It's like the same thing, and you should look at some of these processes. I mean, there is an activity that you have to do to be an approved vendor of a part called the source approval request, the SAR, and this involves anywhere between 100 and 900 pieces of paper that you have to go into fundamental detail into everything around how you're going to package. I mean, it's everything, and it is a very, very difficult process on the industry side, but even on the government side for the, like, engineering support activity, it's another one. When they look at that, the incentives are much stronger to be like, it's too risky to verify this. It's easier just to kind of go to the supplier that went through that process in the 1990s, and so let's kind of keep running that. And so, as we hit before, like, there's a technology element to this, there is a policy element to this, but there's absolutely a cultural and kind of empowerment issue to this as well that's just a tough knot to untangle, I think.
Yeah, so moving from sort of the technology into culture, into organization and policy, I want to pull it up on sort of, complete sort of the triangle or the square, however many points we've done so far, and talk about sort of the macro kind of market environment, right? You've got tariffs, you've got some pretty overt geopolitical sort of tensions occurring right now. Kind of what's that? You got an interesting foxhole in this one, brother.
Yeah,
What's it look like out there?
So let me hit this in 2 ways. Let me talk about how I see macro, and then we also have the perspective. Again, I work with thousands of manufacturers, both suppliers and the 500 employee OEMs that have a third or a half of their supply chain overseas. So I like to actually share both of those. But from the macro perspective, I mean, I think it actually is important to understand the world in which we operate, right? The whole kind of free trade regime, really was established post fall of the Soviet Union. The world looked very, very different in the 90s than it does today. And we can argue back and forth whether like those policies were ever appropriate.
Yeah.
But right now we are in a world where like China looks like they are going to reach 43 to 45% of total global manufacturing capacity by 2030. And that's bonkers. Like that's a value that hasn't been hit. The UK in the Industrial Revolution and the United States post World War II are the only two times that there has ever been one country that was so dominant in manufacturing. And they have done this in a very, very thoughtful, long-term, programmatic way. By essentially, so Chinese are very thoughtful in investing in their national champions, taking drones, like actually putting state capital into DJI, for example, so that company can outcompete everybody else in the world. You then have U.S. consumers looking to buy a cheap drone, and they're like, I could buy one of these from an American company, or I could buy the one that costs 10 times as much. And so so they do the latter, which really means that these U.S. manufacturers are kind of competing with the state-sponsored Chinese company. So they say, to heck with this. Like, I can't be successful here. They go out of business, and then all of the economies of scale continue to accrue to these Chinese national champion manufacturers. And they've done this in pharmaceuticals, in auto, and a lot of these other industries. And it's candidly pretty thoughtful, like strengthening your own industrial capacity and deindustrializing your potential competitors, both at the same time. And I think it's important to look at tariffs through the lens of like what we're up against. Like that is a fundamental problem. Like this deindustrialization of like key sectors, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well and in Japan as well. Like that is a fundamental problem that I think is going to take a generation to reverse.
Yep.
And so the idea that we have like a proactive industrial policy or whatever you want to call it, but you're using the tools of national policy to actually mitigate some of this, I think is actually deeply appropriate. And again, we can argue tariffs and if you should put tariffs on the penguin country or not, or however that all got rolled out. Like we can go through that, but fundamentally, I think that lens is kind of missed when people look at this issue.
As sort of we turn the corner here on the last couple questions. One, just what are you concerned about and optimistic about? Sort of a one-in-one. We've talked about a bunch of different change, interesting sort of juxtapositions of trend intersectionality and some maybe existential things geopolitically. Give me an excited and a concern.
Yeah, let me do the concern first. Let me actually bridge that from this last question here and talk a little bit about commercial manufacturers, because I think those businesses have a hard challenge here. And so some of these, like I'm actually have a non-defense manufacturer in my mind here, but if you look at like a commercial OEM, a commercial original equipment manufacturer that builds, pump or something like that they sell to their customers, those businesses have a fundamental challenge of how to like reorient their supply chains in this new world, but how to do it in like a measured way without basically losing focus on price they need to deliver their things to their customers. And so I think that this whole transition period, so if you believe me that we're fundamentally transitioning from a period of peak globalization or whatever into a period where we're going to be more protective of our national manufacturing economy and maybe our regional manufacturing economy, the period in between what was and what is, that's the dangerous period. Like that's where you get shot. Yeah. That's the breach. Yep. And so all these companies are needing to figure out, like, how do I navigate that? I understand where this is going, but how do I do this in a thoughtful way? And I just would put on the table that speaking from the perspective of those manufacturers is hard. And this is like a core part of our business is like those companies coming to us using our software to say, look, I need to be faster. I need to have more options. And I really don't know how this is going to go. Right, so I almost need the like offshore, the near shore, and the onshore, and I need to do this, and it's happening at the same time that U.S.-based manufacturing suppliers are getting a ton of inbound demand right now, like so much that they're like, oh my gosh, like I can't even like take all these phone calls, and so even like protecting your existing U.S. suppliers when they're getting like chipped away at by like new customers, just this period in between is a challenge, and we really should not underappreciate the position that a lot of those businesses are in and are going to be in for the next, I think this is a 6-month to 3-year transition period here.
Yep.
So that's something that as I think about from the just broader industrial perspective, that is a risk there.
From a, and I'll ask this sort of as the last question, the structure, but, Bret Boyd, king for a day.
Oh, dear.
Sitting up on the high castle, looking down, you wave the wand, you make your decree. What is the one thing and why?
Yeah, look, I've been thinking a lot about this. And since the beginning of the company, actually, there's a book called Freedom's Forged that we give to everybody that joins the company. That's always been part of our ethos and part of our mission. And that book is essentially about the rapid industrialization and essentially like the transformation of commercial manufacturing into defense manufacturing in the late 1930s and early 1940s. We've been thinking about that a lot. And, I think that the country has been a little bit exposed by Ukraine. It has become very, very obvious that this whole stockpile strategy is not going to work for any type of a protracted conflict. Like, I think that has become very, very obvious, which points to the absolute requirement to, like, how do we build more stuff quickly? And the way that we have been thinking about it, and conversations we've actually been having with DoD executives and policymakers, is around this idea of, like, we should build a ready reserve of manufacturing capacity in the United States.
Yep.
Like, that should exist. It should exist tomorrow.
I love that idea.
And in the same way that we have, like, look, you have a merchant marine fleet
Yep.
where commercial ships will register and participate in this network. You have a civil reserve air fleet where cargo aircraft will participate in this network. You have an individual ready reserve, which is a huge body of troops that can be called upon in case something cooks off. Like, there absolutely should be a ready reserve of manufacturing capacity in the country. And, we've been thinking a lot about that because when we look at our software, we essentially have it. Like, if we were able to say, hey, who wants to participate in a manufacturing ready reserve, we would have thousands or tens of thousands of people opt into that. We have them contribute data, most of which we already have, around what machines they have, what experiences they have, what they're good at, et cetera. There's probably another step to have somebody go visit, their facility and kind of walk the floor and maybe even look at their ownership and so on to make sure that there isn't, Chinese ownership, candidly, in these businesses and so on. But if you did something like that, which again is something that we can do with software today that Bill Knutson and the team couldn't have done in the late 1930s. But if you did that with software here today, you would have the ability to rapidly say, okay, the balloon has gone up. Now we've got pathways to say these categories of manufacturing can go here and can go there. And I think the Andurils of the world and the Lockheeds of the world are still going to need to build the super high precision, tip of the spear stuff. But the other, like, 95% of manufactured equipment is really, really appropriate to be built through this distributed network. And I would candidly love to run the experiment of saying, hey, if we want to build 1 million drones a year, like, let's go give Anduril 100,000 or Lockheed 100,000 or whatever, but let's see actually what would it look like to go build 100,000 tier 1 attritable drones via a network of, like, distributed commercial manufacturers. Like, it might be a little bit hairy to kind of work through it at first, but I think it would work.
Super interesting, though. Yeah.
Super interesting, though.
Yeah.
And so that, like, I don't know, that's I think that the most thoughtful and capital efficient investment that you could make right now if you were running the DoD. And again, we should build new automated factories. We should do all the things. Like, we should do all the things. But one of the things that just seems like a no-brainer to me is actually to start to look at, the U.S. manufacturing as a network that can be tapped into.
Yeah, you got to harness what we've got. You can't just focus on the create new. You've got to leverage what we've already got there in a way that can generate an ROI.
Yeah, and to be really clear, like, these businesses are great. Like, there is this moniker of, U.S. manufacturers, these small businesses. And absolutely not. Like, these are multi-hundred employee businesses. They're beautiful facilities. They're skilled craftsmen. There's such artsmanship in machine operators. And, like, we have the ability to crush this as a country. But we just need to do it in the American way, right? Like, empowering these entrepreneurial people to go get after it. Like, that's what this needs to look like.
Dude, that rocks. That's an awesome answer. That fires me up. We should definitely do that. You heard it here first. Manufacturing Ready Reserve. Bret, thanks, brother. as always, I think I leave more fired up than I came in every single time we talk. So thanks for being a partner. Thanks for being a friend. Thanks for being just a force for good in what you and the team at Sustainment are doing. And thanks for swinging by, brother.
Yeah, I appreciate this. Thanks, Tyler.
Heck yeah. Cheers, everybody.